If there's only one God, and no such thing as the Trinity, why Jesus was crying out to the Father when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane? Was he praying to himself? Before answering these questions, let's read first some verses in the Bible for us to know the truth about Jesus. In Matthew 1, verses 21 through 23, "And she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So all this was done, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated, God with us." Verse 21 says, "He will save his people from their sins." Let's go back to Isaiah 43, verse 11. The Lord spoke to prophet Isaiah, saying, I, even I, am the Lord, and besides me there is no Savior. God is clearly telling in this verse that there's no other Savior. If Jesus saves his people from their sins, and God told prophet Isaiah that besides him there's no other Savior, therefore God and Jesus is one person. And that would relate to John 10, verse 30. Jesus said, I and my Father are one, and the very name Emmanuel, which means God with us, not God the Son with us, but God with us. And speaking of God the Son, we can't find even a single verse in the Bible which mentioned that title, but the Bible indeed mentioned Son of God, and there's a huge difference between the two. In John 1, verses 1 and 14, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." In verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." Apostle John had constituted in verse 1 that before the existence of everything was the Word, and not just the Word was with God, but the Word was indeed God himself. In verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us," Apostle John clearly illustrated in this verse that God, who is the creator of all things, became flesh and dwelt among us, which is definitely connected to Matthew 1, verse 23, that God with us. Therefore, that word in the beginning which Apostle John mentioned in John 1, verse 1, is definitely Jesus. Now let's go back to these questions. If there's only one God and no such thing as the Trinity, why Jesus was crying out to the Father when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane? Was he praying to himself? Remember that when God became flesh, he became 100% man, but he was also 100% God. In other words, when Jesus was on earth, he had two natures, humanity and divinity. As a man, he cried when Lazarus died, but as a God, he raised Lazarus from the dead. When Jesus was crying to the Father, it was his human nature. It was him as a man. He was afraid to be crucified, that's why he prayed to God. Matthew 26, verses 36 through 42. "Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said to the disciples, Sit here while I go and pray over there. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, a second time, he went away and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. Also, Jesus wanted to show us that as human beings and as Christians, if we face trials and difficulties in life, we have to cry out and pray to God. Then in the end we will say, Your will be done, Lord.